Hi. Usually, when people discuss the Soviet Union, they tend to think of it as a country like any other. And, this is fairly understandable. The Soviet Union, for most of its history, generally acted like a nation-state and was treated like one by all the other states. However, when the Union was officially established in 1922, in the aftermath of the Russian Civil War, the intention was not to create a singular nation. Not even in the federal sense, like the USA, later Yugoslavia, or the current Russian Federation, all of which consist of semi-autonomous republics or states under a single central government. While the comparison isn't perfect, the original vision was something closer to an organization like the European Union, ASEAN, or even the United Nations. The Soviet Union had an internationalist aim. It was, technically, founded to be a union between many equal and independent states, each with their own governments and sovereignty. December 30th of 2022 marks the 100th anniversary since the official founding of the Soviet Union. Now, a century later and in the midst of another war in the region, there is no better time to delve a little deeper into that period to try and understand why exactly the Union was created in the first place. So, in this video, we will go over the context and the debate that shaped the structure of the Soviet Union as it was founded, and try to understand why certain decisions were made rather than others. I also want to especially highlight the internationalist tendency of the radical left of that era, which often gets overlooked due to the various nation-state-based narratives that dominate our historical understanding. Further, it is worth just specifying the exact differences between the Soviet Union itself, its various member republics, and all the other socialist states outside the Union. All of this seems to get easily confused by many people more often than they should, as general terms like the Soviet bloc or Soviet Russia sometimes obstruct the actual organizational structures that were in place. In short, rather than looking too much into what the USSR became in its later decades, this video is about how and why it was created in the first place. Therefore, the focus will mainly be in the early 1920s. So, let's dive in. Before 1922, waiting for the World Revolution. As the mass suffering and instability caused by the First World War enabled the October Revolution in Russia, the Bolsheviks who took power were not limiting their ambitions only to Russia. Equipped with a firm belief in historical materialism and the expectation that capitalism's inner contradictions were ripe for global collapse at any moment, the October Revolution was to be the beginning of the wider world revolution. Scholar of Russian history Moshe Levin wrote, "The October Revolution had neither meaning nor future independent of its international function as a catalyst and detonator. It was to be the first spark that would lead to the establishment of socialist regimes in countries which, unlike Russia, possessed an adequate economic, infrastructure and cultural basis. Unless it fulfilled this function, the Soviet regime should not even have survived." The absolute necessity of the revolution to spread worldwide was understood by Lenin and other leading Bolsheviks. It was based on Marx's original theory of revolution.
Ever hear of Karl Marx? In his mind, communism was born more than 100 years ago. He looked at the world and saw men as divided into two classes, workers and capitalists.
According to Marx, the most highly developed capitalist nations would be the first to experience revolution, since they had the largest and most developed proletarian class, which would be the main revolutionary agent. For the Bolsheviks, there was one pretty big problem with all this. This description did not fit Russia of the 1910s at all. The industry and urban proletariat was utterly undeveloped, as it was an overwhelmingly agrarian society. Therefore, the fact that the revolution was able to occur first in Russia was something of a surprise even to most of the revolutionaries themselves. To explain this gap between predictions and reality, Lenin developed a new theory that said that since capitalism was a world system, it was natural that the revolution would begin from its periphery rather than from its core. The chain would break from its weakest link, even if it lacked the exact economic basis described by Marx. This explained why the revolution occurred in Russia. In this metaphor, while Russia was only a single link in the chain, breaking just one link was believed to be enough to lead into the entire system starting to crumble down. Therefore, the expectation was that the German Revolution, with its strong developed proletariat that Marxist theory had highlighted, would soon take place as well. These hopes started to dim as the World Revolution seemingly did not get any closer in the late 1910s. Reflecting on this fact in 1921, Trotsky said, "Only now do we see and feel that we are not so extremely close to the final goal, the winning of power, the World Revolution." At that time, in 1919, we thought it was a matter of months, and now we say it is perhaps a matter of years. We cannot say precisely, but we know all the better that development is headed in this direction. While the belief in the coming world revolution was still maintained, the theories on its speed and location had to be continuously adapted to conform with the new reality. With no German or any other revolution in sight, the Bolsheviks had to buckle down and try to survive on their own against various threats. The biggest of these were the many domestic anti-Bolshevik forces, as well as the intervention by the capitalist powers like Britain, US and Japan. As long as the new revolutionary government survived long enough, the other socialist revolutions would still surely occur and come to its support, even if it was taking a bit longer than initially expected. During this period of 1917 to 1922, there wasn't any single structure over what used to be the Russian Empire, as the Soviet Union did not exist yet. Rather, the Bolsheviks took over the Russian Republic that had been established less than a year earlier in the February Revolution. In 1918, some months after the October Revolution had put the Bolsheviks in the leadership, the Republic was officially renamed as the Russian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic, the RSFSR. By 1920, various other Soviet Socialist Republics, or SSRs, emerged in other territories, all proclaiming themselves as independent. Some of these attempts lasted only for a very short time, as they got incorporated into neighboring larger entities or simply disappeared from history altogether as quickly as they had appeared. While these new socialist republics were ideologically and often materially very connected to the Russian SFSR, they were still separate entities. With multiple socialist republics already declared and many more expected to emerge as the revolution spread, the question became, how should these entities be effectively organized together, especially in relation to Russia? Already in 1920, Lenin listed 3 trends that favored creating a close union. In recognizing that federation is a transitional form to complete unity, it is necessary to strive for ever closer federal unity, bearing in mind, first, that the Soviet republics, surrounded as they are by the imperialist powers of the whole world, which from the military standpoint are immeasurably stronger, cannot possibly continue to exist without the closest alliance. Second, that a close economic alliance between the Soviet republics is necessary, otherwise the productive forces which have been ruined by imperialism cannot be restored and the well-being of the working people cannot be ensured. Third, that there is a tendency towards the creation of a single world economy regulated by the proletariat of all nations as an integral whole and according to a common plan. This tendency has already revealed itself quite clearly under capitalism and is bound to be further developed and consummated under socialism. In short, Lenin was saying that a transnational union would be advantageous militarily against capitalist aggressions, economically in rebuilding and developing production, and lastly, in line with the growing world trend of globalization and international interdependency. As he says, the union was to be a transitional form to complete unity. In other words, a stepping stone for further development where state borders and states in general would eventually disappear completely. As Lenin noted, internationalism in world politics had been experiencing something of a trend in the late 1910s, not just in socialist circles. The First World War had a profound effect on how people saw international relations and the role of diplomacy. The conception of that war as the war to end all wars was really taken quite literally. In the post-war period, the emerging world order had as its main mission to prevent such disastrous conflicts from ever occurring again. This was most famously reflected in the US President Woodrow Wilson's 14 Points Proclamation and the following efforts to launch the League of Nations, the predecessor to the current United Nations.
Woodrow Wilson then set out across the country in a valorous attempt to rally the American people to his shining visions. The abolition of war from the earth forever.
For socialists, internationalism was of course always a very important value. Lenin's ideas, which I just quoted, came out in 1920, the same year that the League of Nations was established, and the two visions shared some clear similarities. However, Lenin still made sure to differentiate the socialist internationalism from the liberal one. Petty bourgeois nationalism proclaims as internationalism the mere recognition of the equality of nations and nothing more. This recognition is purely verbal. Petty bourgeois nationalism preserves national self-interest intact, whereas proletarian internationalism demands, first, that the interests of the proletarian struggle in any one country should be subordinated to the interests of that struggle on a worldwide scale, and second, that a nation which is achieving victory over the bourgeoisie should be able and willing to make the greatest national sacrifices for the overthrow of international capital. In other words, the world revolution and internationalist struggle was to always take priority over any single nation's aims. Understanding the world through class analysis was an inherently internationalist view. The socialist countries would all share the common goal of class war and support it over their own national interests. This was totally unlike the loosely connected countries in the League of Nations, which only promised to recognize each other as independent states and not go much further than that. Despite Lenin's views, a union was not the obvious solution in Russia at this point. The Russian Soviet Republic made bilateral treaties with the other republics in 1920 and 1921. This gave Russia the right to represent them internationally, among other things. Since Russia was a federation, it had already absorbed a number of initially independent republics into itself as semi-autonomous regions under the control of the Russian central government. The main debate would be on this question. Should all the independent socialist republics be simply absorbed into the Russian federative state, or should they keep their status as independent states with their own governments? (1922) The debate on the structure of the Union. The main disagreement on the issue was between Lenin and Stalin. Stalin favored simply making all the independent republics as part of the Russian SFSR and thus directly under the Russian government's control. This was, unsurprisingly, met with criticism from the smaller republics. Stalin replied by claiming that they were promoting reactionary nationalism for not agreeing to being absorbed into Russia. Stalin's idea did have some merit in the sense that the Russians were already in a dominant position towards the other republics anyway. Absorbing them into Russia would simply make this already existing arrangement more official and put into law. However, Lenin opposed Stalin's views and strongly demanded that the republics keep their independence. This debate was mostly taking place in 1922, and Lenin was already quite sick at that point. Still, he managed to intervene and demanded a version of the Union that had equal rights among all the states, including the freedom for any republic to leave the Union at will. The Union was also to be led collectively by organs higher than any one republic's government, instead having equal representation within the leadership from each member state. From his revisions to Stalin's initial suggestions, Lenin wrote in September 1922, "In my opinion, the matter is of utmost importance. Stalin tends to be somewhat hasty. We consider ourselves, the Ukrainian USSR and others, equal, and enter with them on an equal basis into a new union, a new federation, the Union of the Soviet Republics of Europe and Asia." Months later, in October, Lenin wrote again from his sickbed a strongly worded demand. "I declare war to the death on dominant nation chauvinism. I shall eat it with all my healthy teeth as soon as I get rid of this accursed bad tooth. It must be absolutely insisted that the Union Central Executive Committee should be presided over in turn by a Russian, Ukrainian, Georgian, etc. Absolutely. Despite his sickly condition and physical absence from the debates, Lenin's opinions were highly regarded in the leadership and his ideas for the Union were eventually accepted, as Stalin conceded. So, on December 30th of 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was officially established. The founding members of the USSR were the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, the Transcaucasian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic. The Russian and the Transcaucasian federations were federal republics, which means they contained further autonomous republics under them, which were not themselves independent states but had varying levels of autonomy. The Transcaucasian Federation was made of the Republic of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, which had initially been totally independent republics for about a year or two, and would again become so in 1936 as the federation got dissolved. As one can see, the USSR at its foundation was an organization of independent nations, and in principle, the Russian SFSR was merely one member among others, though its size and power compared to the rest was quite clear from the start. Each of the independent republics kept their own governments and administrations on most issues, excluding some fields like foreign policy. The number of republics would of course change many times over the years, with the final number at dissolution in 1991 being 15. The aims of the Union were laid down in a declaration made with the treaty for the foundation of the Union. The already discussed Lenin's points from 1920 about economic and security advantages were repeated, as was the internationalism. The very structure of Soviet power, internationalist by its class essence, is prompting the working masses of the Soviet republics to unite within a single socialist commonwealth. The rights of the independent republics were underlined as well. This union is a voluntary association of peoples with equal rights, and each republic is ensured freedom of secession from the Union. Finally, the aim towards a single communist world is made very apparent. The Union is open to all socialist Soviet republics, both those which already exist and those yet to arise. The Union will serve as a sure bulwark against world capitalism and a further major step towards uniting the working people of all lands in a world socialist Soviet republic. The last section makes it clear that the ultimate goal of the Union was for itself to become unnecessary. The entire world would, eventually, be united under a single world socialist Soviet republic, thus rendering any union on a national level useless. There will be only one republic after all. We can compare this with the Marxist aim of a classless society, for they share a similar logic. If there remained only one class that included everyone, classes would no longer exist. In the same way, when the entire world would exist as one state, there would no longer be states as such. As economist Branko Milanovic pointed out in his recent blog on this topic, the USSR also had no geographical limits in its name, such as continents as in the European Union or the United States of America. This is yet another sign of its global aims. Similarly, in the official emblem of the USSR, the sickle and the hammer stretches across the entire planet being painted red, symbolizing the final goal. So, in this sense, we can say that the Soviet Union at its founding established as its goal the eventual dissolution of itself. The Union would keep expanding its members until it would cover the whole world. There was also one particular institution that was established to help make this certain fate occur a little bit faster. The Comintern, exporting the world revolution. Since the world revolution was seemingly not happening by itself, the wheel of history clearly needed some assistance from the Bolsheviks. The key institution in the story of Soviet internationalism was the Comintern. Shortened from the Communist International, it was founded in 1919 and its primary purpose was to assist revolutionary parties and radical individuals in other countries to help facilitate the world revolution. Lenin closed the founding Congress of the Comintern in 1919 by saying, "The victory of the proletarian revolution on a world scale is assured. The founding of an international Soviet Republic is on the way." As has become clear, the goal of a singular republic encompassing the entire world was openly and proudly declared throughout these early years. The Comintern was the main tool for helping this to come true, as it assisted numerous movements across the world. It is worth noting that the Comintern was not officially or legally part of Russia's or the Soviet Union's administration at any point. Rather, it was a global organization between various communist and left-wing parties. Nonetheless, it was quite heavily controlled by the Soviets, and especially in later years it became closer and closer to just being a direct channel of Soviet foreign policy. However, especially in the early 1920s, Comintern did have its independent policies and could sometimes even directly clash with the Soviet Foreign Ministry over certain issues. This caused some confusion abroad, as many simply equated the Comintern with the Soviet state. One such instance was when the Soviet government, in dire need of improving its economy, started making trade treaties with capitalist countries like Japan and Britain in the 1920s. At the same time, the Comintern continued to insult these countries and openly called for revolutions in them. When the countries complained about this, the Soviets just said that the Comintern was an unrelated international organization that did not represent them, and it should therefore not affect bilateral ties in any way. In this way, the Soviets could take advantage of the situation to simultaneously both support revolutionary activities while also improving foreign relations and trade. Understandably, this was seen as contradictory and in bad faith from the point of view of the other countries. This internationalist spirit of the 1920s would not last for long. We'll now look closer at how the Soviet international relations changed under Stalin, from fanning the flames of world revolution and dreaming of a world socialist Soviet Republic, to the real politics expected of a more traditional nation-state. Post-Lenin, the Soviet Union's foreign relations and decline of internationalism. Lenin left the political stage after a stroke in early 1923 and then died in early 1924. While his preferred structure of the Union remained in place, in practice the USSR ended up coming closer to Stalin's original vision than Lenin's. The autonomy for each republic changed to some degree depending on each era, but generally Russia came to heavily dominate the others. Despite it being legally possible, no republic ever tried to leave the Union before the late 1980s, and it is hard to believe such a thing would have been ever allowed. This was certainly not the only time where the reality of the Soviet Union did not follow in the spirit of its proclamations. Unlike the initial expectations, the USSR also did not keep expanding by accepting further members beyond what the old Russian Empire had controlled. Even though plenty of socialist countries emerged after World War II, they were integrated to the so-called Eastern Bloc only through additional international organizations like the Warsaw Pact or the Comintern, not as members of the Soviet Union itself. At the same time, the Baltic countries of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, which had previously been part of the pre-1917 Russian Empire, got directly integrated into the Soviet Union in 1945 as Socialist Soviet Republics. Of course, this did not mean that the people's republics outside of the USSR were not heavily influenced by it. While different ways of implementing socialist policy were allowed to some degree, major dissident moves were not tolerated, as seen in Hungary in 1956 and in Czechoslovakia in 1968. There were also cases like the Mongolian People's Republic, which had been an independent state since 1924 and not a member of the Soviet Union, while still being almost completely controlled by Russia and widely integrated into it. These kind of satellite states were used to uphold Soviet economic and military goals, but were left out of the Union itself. Then why were they not made into member states of the USSR? Well, at this point, the internationalist ideal had long disappeared under Stalinist socialism in one country policy. While foreign revolutionary movements were still supported as far as they fit Soviet foreign policy needs, the aims for the Soviet Union becoming the overarching administration over the whole world had been abandoned. Stalin was very clear about this turn in policy during an interview in 1936. He said that the Soviet Union had in fact never intended to bring about a world revolution, and such ideas abroad were simply a misunderstanding. The export of revolution is nonsense. Every country will make its own revolution if it wants to, and if it does not want to, there will be no revolution. To assert that we want to make a revolution in other countries, to interfere in their lives, means saying what is untrue and what we have never advocated. Following a similar logic, Stalin disbanded the Comintern in 1943. He needed to reassure the Allies during World War II that he was no longer seeking to overthrow them through revolution, and many of them were especially suspicious of the Comintern because of its history of agitation. Being so fully under Russia's control by then, the organization had become institutionally redundant anyway. In the highly centralized Stalinist state, there was no space for different policy directions apart from Russia's geopolitical goals. At any rate, by the time of its disbandment, the Comintern had lost much of its credibility internationally. It had completely turned on itself several times in service of the Soviet foreign policy, most notably switching from the total anti-fascist line to cheering for the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939, and then suddenly circling back to anti-fascism after Germany began its attack in 1941. The move away from internationalism naturally gave way to more nationalism domestically in the Soviet Union. While Lenin's original vision was more in accordance with the words of Marx and Engels that the workers do not have a fatherland, Stalin's era saw a complete opposite turn on this question. The USSR was made into the socialist fatherland that promoted Soviet patriotism in increasingly Russocentric forms. The idea of defending the Soviet Union uncritically was claimed as the best way to promote class struggle and socialism. In the end, this Soviet patriotism turned out not to be very distinguishable from general nationalism seen everywhere else. The changes were reflected across society, such as in the names of the institutions which moved closer to those of other states. Commissariats became ministries in 1946, and the Supreme Soviet came to be referred as the Soviet Parliament, bringing it closer to the Western standard of a nation-state. The Cold War, that had started as a conflict between two totally different ways of understanding and organizing politics, gradually just became a battle between two nation-states in the traditional sense, and their spheres of influence. With all this being said, the original aims established by Lenin were still important to the Soviet leadership for legitimizing itself, both for domestic and foreign audiences. The idea of the USSR as an international project did not fade away easily from popular imagination, and the leadership still opted to occasionally use the internationalist rhetoric to legitimize itself. The idea of the USSR as an equal union open to more states continued to haunt its image, both in its own rhetoric and the minds of revolutionaries abroad. For example, when the United Nations was established in 1945, the USSR suggested that all of its at the time 15 independent republics should be in the UN as separate countries, and thus have their own votes. This was in the context of Western countries like Britain having plenty of their colonial territories as separate members. America replied by demanding that each of its 48 states should then have the same treatment, which obviously was not acceptable to the Soviets. The somewhat nonsensical ending compromise was that the USSR received 3 seats, one for the Soviet Union itself, one for Ukraine, and one for Belarus. Despite the USSR not being open to new members by the 1940s, many people in the new socialist republics like Yugoslavia were still fully expecting to become members of the USSR. As another example, the People's Republic of Bulgaria asked to join the USSR several times through the years, but was never accepted. Ironically, it was perhaps the West that often kept believing in the internationalist rhetoric the most, or at least pretended to do so.
The leaders of Russia tell us their only concern is the defense of their own nation. Is this so? Or are they ambitious for world conquest?
claims of the Soviet Union actively trying to take over the world were effective for spreading the Red Scare, repressing domestic radicals, and legitimizing military spending. In the late 1940s, when such fears were at their highest in the US, the Soviet Union had already moved away from such policies decades earlier. Conclusions. There is no doubt that the original aims behind the Soviet Union were deeply rooted in internationalism. That vision remained in its organizational structure, legal text, and rhetorics. However, it is entirely understandable that many people have ended up simply seeing the Soviet Union as just another state, rather than a transnational union. After the 1920s, the reality of the USSR was undeniably that of Russian domination, with a lack of independence for the republics and with no effort to put expanding the union further. As one example of how to toe this line between ideal and reality when talking about the Soviet Union, Wikipedia compromises in its article for the USSR by noting that it was a transcontinental country that spanned much of Eurasia from 1922 to 1991. A flagship communist state, it was nominally a federal union comprising 15 top-level republics. In practice, both its government and its economy were built on a highly centralized model until its final years. So, a note on its base as a union, but otherwise calls it a country or a state. This seems fair enough to me, though generally people seem to simply ignore the union part entirely. In any case, I do think it is worth remembering the original ideals that led to the union's creation. They remind us that the basic idea was for something fundamentally different to the existing models of organizing a state. Ignoring the original internationalist ideas plays into the hegemonic narratives of the current nation-states, which makes it seem as if they are historically deterministic and that there could be no alternative ways of organization. Understanding the origins of the Union also helps in recognizing where the legitimacy of the USSR was primarily based on and why it stuck with that rhetoric for such a long time. In addition to Soviet history, the topic also has obvious relevance on a world scale. Through their internationalist thought, the Bolsheviks, using the Comintern, had a very meaningful impact across the globe. The direct and indirect support in the forms of funding and advice to various revolutionary groups in different countries helped to instigate countless protests, political movements, and revolutions. The tens of thousands of radicals involved looked up to Russia and the Soviet Union as a model for their own ambitions. They read texts printed in the USSR, received academic or military training there, and were directly advised by Comintern advisors. Sometimes well, sometimes not so well, but nonetheless in historically significant ways. While the world revolution has not come to being, the historical consequences of Soviet internationalism and its revolutionary ideals are undeniable, even now, 100 years later. Since this was my first video, I'd love to have some feedback on pretty much any aspect from technical sides to the content itself or the voice quality or whatever else. Obviously, I had to simplify and leave out certain things, so I'm sure there can be disagreement about what was said here. I focused almost purely on the differences between the early Lenin era and the Stalin era that followed it. The later periods of the Soviet Union also had significantly different approaches, as for example under Khrushchev, internationalism had something of a resurgence. It would also be relevant to our discussion on the rights of the republics to look at the dissolution of the Union and the attempts to reform it in the early 1990s, as the core problem of the relations between centralized power and the supposedly sovereign republics became very clear then. In my next video, I want to discuss the Comintern and its strategies in more detail. I will especially look at its role in China, particularly during the so-called First United Front in the mid-1920s. That is actually the topic I wanted to talk about all along, but realized it needed some contextualization first, and suddenly I had way too much content for just a single video. So here we are. I hope this video was able to spark your interest and that you stick around for more in the future. Leave me a comment or send me a DM here on YouTube or elsewhere. You can find my socials on the screen or on my profile. Thank you for watching.